So, at the beginning of April, I got it into my head that it was time to go back to in-person outdoor office hours. And I scheduled them for the next Friday, which was 2 Fridays ago. I mean, things have been kind of warm. You may recall the weather was really nice. I was really looking forward to getting out of the house. And I was really looking forward to something that at least felt a little bit more normal than my job over the winter, than all our Zoom time and our phone meetings and our email chains. So I was pretty excited. And I was excited enough that I completely ignored the weather forecast for that Friday. And I set up my outdoor office hours and was a little bit disappointed to discover that on that Friday, it was snowing. We had a snowstorm. I think you remember it. But I still wanted these office hours. I still wanted something that I could recognize. I still wanted to see people in 3D. So I sat there in my garage with the garage door open, and there's like a side door so I could create a breeze. And I sat there freezing for 2 hours waiting for someone to come visit me. Now, of course, no one visited, and that's okay. It was snowing. This was my problem. But I bring that story up right now because I think we're all feeling a little restless. We're all getting ready for a return to something that feels more normal. Even though we know intellectually that so much has happened over the last 18 months, that whatever is coming next will be at least somewhat different from what has gone before. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the old normal and the new normal and the time in between. What Susan Beaumont, one of our readings, says is a liminal season, a time of disruption that alters us. So let's take a moment now to think of our own hopes and wishes for the new normal, to think about what we have learned, and think a little bit about what we're not going to bring with us. Blessed be, and welcome to this service.
Please join me in the recitation of our covenant. In the love of truth and in the spirit of Jesus, we unite for the worship of God and the service of all. Good morning. We have 3 readings to share with you this morning. The first is from Lord of the Rings. The second comes from How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You Are Going by Susan Beaumont. And the third comes from the Gospel of Matthew. So hear these words. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began, Now far ahead, the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with weary feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet. And whither then? I cannot say. That sounds a bit like old Bilbo's rhyming, said Pippin. Or is it one of your imitations? It does not sound altogether encouraging. I don't know, said Frodo. It came to me then as if I was making it up, but I may have heard it long ago. Certainly it reminds me very much of Bilbo in the last years before he went away. He used to often say that there was only one road, that it was like a great river. Its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. It's dangerous business, Frodo, going out of your door, he used to say. You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Do you realize that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood? And that if you let it, it might take you to the lonely mountain or even further to worse places. He used to say that on the path outside the front door at Bag End, especially after he had been out for a long walk. Well, the road won't sweep me anywhere for an hour at least, said Pippin, unslinging his pack. The others followed his example, putting their packs against the bank and their legs out into the road. After a rest, they had a good lunch. And then, more rest. From Lord of the Rings. And our second reading by Susan Beaumont. She writes, wonder is the ability to suspend judgment and to hold competing thoughts and values in tension. Wonder arrives when we acknowledge that experience is always larger than our ability to interpret it. We hold our interpretations more loosely and ponder the interpretations of others. In a state of wonder, we perceive the organization from its edges and boundaries rather than from the center. We develop a rich capacity for challenging unstated assumptions and seeing things with fresh eyes. Attending is a capacity for deep seeing and listening. It is an act of being fully present in the moment. It is not simply an act of hearing or remembering what was said or done. Attending is becoming fully awake to all that is happening, to the full potential within and around me. My spouse and I enjoy bicycling, and we often take biking vacations. Several years ago, we took a biking vacation to Maine through Acadia National Park. We are from the Midwest, which makes us Flatlanders. Acadia National Park almost did me in. The gentle rolling hills described in the travel brochure were hyperbole. The hills before us were large and formidable. I was struggling. Early in the ride, I discovered a riding technique that worked for me on the hills. I found that I was easily discouraged by the size of a hill when I saw the enormity of it in front of me. So I learned how to look down at the road beneath my feet when pedaling up the hill. I would count the number of revolutions of my pedals from 1 to 10 and then begin again. In this simple manner, I managed to stay in the moment and not get overwhelmed by what lay ahead. count to 10, begin again, just keep pedaling. It became my mantra. I never looked up. And in this manner, I conquered one hill after another. It seemed to be working. And so I attached myself to this approach with ferocity. I blocked out everything else. The voice in my head was an advocating voice. This is what works. Don't stray from the plan. Just keep doing this thing that works. Until it simply didn't work anymore. My legs wouldn't complete a single additional rotation. And so I climbed off the bike in defeat, soaked by the rain. At that moment, a quiet voice somewhere in the back of my head whispered, "Look up." I glanced up to witness a remarkable vista. In front of me was the verdant green crest of an enormous hill. Atop the hill was a quaint white lighthouse with a bright red roof. Arched from one side of the hill to the other, just over the top of the lighthouse, was a full rainbow, the likes of which I had never seen. A complete arc with every color of the spectrum fully alive and dancing in the sunbeams that pierced the raindrops. In that moment, the ridiculous nature of my advocating approach, look down and keep on pedaling, became fully apparent to me. I had almost missed this moment of awe and beauty. This was the thing I had signed on for, an experience in nature. And yet, in my sustained effort to master the goal of the ride, it almost passed me by. Had I looked up sooner, the beauty of the topography would have sustained me in my efforts. The beauty and majesty of the landscape broke through my defenses, and at once I was attendant to all that surrounded me. I was part of the terrain. It was part of me. And we were all part of God's magnificent creation. An advocating stance comes from a place of fear and reveals an absence of courage. When the uncertainty of a situation becomes too unwieldy, we wrestle it down to a manageable scale. We pretend to be in control by adopting a principle, position, or an approach to advance. It's not a coincidence that my shift in stance happened in a moment of failure. When we come face to face with the limited capacity of our own efforts, we are suddenly open to a change in perspective, to seeing with fresh eyes all that had previously been unseen. When failure breaks us open, we are ready to receive. To surrender is to yield, to submit to the powerful reality of what is, to take a long, loving look at what is real, to welcome the situation in front of you. Surrender means accepting the past for what it was, accepting and embracing the present reality, yielding to the mystery of the future and the mystery of God in that future. When I surrender, I accept my experience as something that must be by necessity, so that I can learn what I need to learn, to become what I need to become, in order to embrace my future. Words from Susan Beaumont. Beautiful words. And finally, our last reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 7 through 14. As you go, make this proclamation. The reign of heaven has drawn near. Heal those who are sick, raise the dead, cure leprosy, expel demons. You received freely. Now, freely give. Take neither gold nor silver nor copper for your money belts. No traveling bag, no change of clothes, no sandals, no walking staff, for workers deserve their keep. Look for worthy people in whatever town or village you come to, and stay with them until you leave. As you enter a house, bless it. If the home is deserving, your peace will descend on it. If it isn't, your peace will return to you. If anyone does not receive you or listen to what you have to say, leave that house or town. And once outside it, shake its dust from your feet. There and end this morning's readings. And as we now start to settle our bodies and quiet our minds, let us open our hearts in the spirit of prayer. We'll begin with a moment of silence to settle, to lift up prayers for all of those in need of our prayers this morning. God of mercy and grace, we ask that you stir in our hearts loving spirits this morning. It has been a heavy week, a week of joy and grief and horror and celebration woven fine, as so often is the case in the life of a human, right? We witnessed what is almost justice, perhaps what we might call accountability in Minneapolis this week. God, we witnessed accountability, and let this witnessing open our hearts to a thirst, a hunger for justice, for reform or abolition or whatever it is that we believe might bring about your will, your kingdom, the commonwealth of heaven here on earth. We rest and we breathe and we nourish our spirits, knowing that the road ahead is long. And remembering too that we must look up so that we do not miss the rainbows, the joy, the celebration. We recommit to a fierce hope. Be with us, God, today and all days. And now let us join together in the prayer that Jesus taught. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow it if I can, pursuing it with weary feet, until it joins some larger way where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say. And whither then I cannot say. Now, those of us who are familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien, those of us who have even read a little bit or seen the movies, know that his literature is full of stories of returning. And in some ways, this poem is the thesis statement of much of his work. In The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, characters cycle from there to back again, often. The hobbits, for example, all long to return to the Shire. But, of course, when they do, they find that they and it have changed, that the road has moved ever on. Now, Tolkien, a veteran of the First World War, knew what it was like to come back from an adventure, profoundly altered. And he knew that the world around him, while seemingly familiar, had changed as well. He was familiar with these liminal seasons that we are talking about today. Points in our lives that Susan Beaumont describes as being disorienting periods of non-structure or anti-structure that open new possibilities, no longer based on old status or power. New identities, she says, are explored, and new possibilities considered. New identities are explored, and new possibilities are considered. For Tolkien, he used fiction to explain this same concept. And we are familiar with this dynamic too. And not just because of the pandemic. The road has always gone ever on for us. And we know it always will, no matter how much we would like to stop it. I remember, for example, getting together with my old friends a couple of years after graduating from high school. We all happened to be home for the summer, or at least for that weekend, so we gathered at someone's house to catch up. And it turned out during that visit that we were pretty good with the reminiscing part. You know, do you remember when? But when we got to the catching up part, what have you been up to lately? We realized that we weren't the same people we had been when we knew each other just a couple of years before. We had all developed different interests and passions. We had, some of us, met the people we would eventually marry. We were planning lives and branching out in ways that did not include each other at all. Mostly it was a good visit. Still, though we have kept in touch on social media, and I officiated a couple of weddings, I haven't actually seen most of those folks since. I actually have not seen them, at least in person. For the most part, that is because we took our separate paths. Of course, right before that gathering, we had experienced the liminal season of our college years, a time when many paths and errands meet, where there were so many forces working on us to make us the people we became. And there just hasn't been a time since that time, 30 years ago, to turn back the clock. What was normal for us had changed. And we couldn't go back even if we wanted to the old normal. You see, we human beings keep stepping out. We keep moving and growing and changing. It's a dangerous business going out your door, writes Tolkien. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there is no knowing where you might be swept off to. There is no knowing where you might be swept off to. Now, this is a sermon for Sunday. It's not a John Cougar Mellencamp song. So, I have to say, I'm not terribly nostalgic about my high school years. I'm telling you this story instead for a different reason. I'm telling you this story because so many of you have had similar stories. Relationships can falter or they can strengthen over time, particularly when change is in the air, when our final outcomes are uncertain. And what determines, ultimately, the outcome of those relationships is our decision, our shared decision, either to continue forward together or to go our separate ways. Relationships take constant work. We all know this. There have been times when we have made the hard choice to say goodbye because so much has changed. And there have been times where we have decided to experience these changes together, understanding that we are not ever going to be who we were. Not only am I not that high school graduate anymore, I am not the person I was when I got married, or the one I was when I became a dad, or when I was called to this church. I mean, I like those guys, but it's a good thing that the relationships that have stood the test of time have changed and molded me as we have grown together. We see this same dynamic, not just in our personal lives, but in the country at large too, probably even the world. These days we talk a lot about returning to normal, but then we remember that the old normal wasn't always that great. This week, many of us rejoiced at the news that George Floyd's killer, Officer Derek Chauvin, was found guilty of murder. The old normal would have him hide behind his badge and walk away. And at this moment, we do not know if things will change all that much, if the old normal is really gone. If a national urge toward things as they always have been will stunt any momentum from this moment. But we know that there's a new normal, too, in this case, and that through painful deliberation and hard conversation, we are all, ever so slowly, fighting for a different understanding of race, violence, and policing in America. We are changing the rules of a relationship. And this, too, is just a beginning, part of a national process of coming together, putting aside our own plans and agendas to walk the path toward justice as hard as it may be. So many things in this return to normal will not actually be the same. That ship has sailed. We are not who we were a couple years ago, and we are pointed toward the future. And now, up ahead, we see the approach of something different. The first impressions of the new thing. So something different is actually approaching. Something different is actually approaching. And it's approaching here at church, too. This week I met with the people in the church who have the hard task of figuring out what will ultimately be our return to indoor, in-person worship. Something that will probably still be different, but at least feel like normal. And I'll tell you, this isn't an easy job. Each of us has experienced our own trauma from the past year or so. Each of us has our own opinion about any number of issues and sub-issues around the reopening. So we are learning to move with patience and with intention, to work together, to, in some sense, make the opposite choice from that one made by my high school friends. Staying together instead of drifting apart. And that means talking. And that means listening too. And that means responding, not just with our heads, but with our hearts. On May 2nd, as long as it doesn't snow, we will begin weekly outdoor worship services to go with our online YouTube services. And probably what I am most excited about, we will begin coffee hour for both groups on the church lawn. This is our first step back onto the road. This is what our deliberations have brought us to. And then we will all be swept off, taking the next step and the next and the next to whatever comes next. That is how relationships work in liminal times. We communicate, we connect, and we move with varying levels of courage and trepidation. We move forward together. Long-term relationships, no matter what the context is, are less about me and you and more about us. Less about me and you and more about us. So, the liminal season calls us to shake the dust from our sandals as we follow the paths and tributaries before us. It calls us to set aside our agendas and our rules and our plans to make room for the new spirit, the new energy that presents itself, to make room for what Beaumont calls wonder. To make room for wonder. A culture of radical hospitality does not rest on achievable practicalities, but on working toward a larger dream, a dream for a just society, for a healthy relationship, or for a thriving and inclusive church. And right now, in what is hopefully the tail end of our liminal season, it is time to dream. Right now, it is time to dream and to journey together. Aware of our differences, aware of each other, while also being aware of the limits of our own vision. Beaumont tells us that wonder is the ability to suspend judgment and to hold competing thoughts and values in tension. Wonder arrives, she says, when we acknowledge that experience is always larger than our ability to interpret it. That experience is always larger than our ability to interpret it. That's an idea that is sometimes, frankly, hard to grasp. But that wonder is where the adventure together is. So this is a time of wonder, this liminal season. Yeah, there's a lot of garbage to sift through too, but I know that we can do it. We can be open to each other in order to discern a path that will take us through whatever adventure there is to come. Otherwise, we may just, to paraphrase last week's reading from Seamus Heaney, we may just repeat ourselves and our every last mistake. So let's take a moment now in silence to be open to the Spirit as it flows through our lives and act knowing that we are doing a new thing rather than rebuilding the old one. And rejoice. Rejoice that we have the chance to repair what has been broken in our connections as we move on together, as individuals, as a church, as a country, and as a human species gathered in this place. Blessed be.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow, giving, receiving, as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
Try that again. Go forth in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you will burst into song, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Amen, and blessed be. This concludes our service today. I hope you have a blessed Sabbath Thank you for being here. Bye.